we're going to take a little hike again. This is going to be, again, on the Florida National Scenic Trail. We've done a couple, I believe a couple already, of programs about the Florida National Scenic Trail, but we'll be talking a little bit more about the Florida Trail a little bit later on in its history. And this is a section through the Seminole State Forest, and it was a Sierra Club outing that we took back in February of this year, before the world changed. So if you don't know where that state forest is, this little red circle is Orlando, and you know where you are. And just a little bit north of Orlando is the Seminole State Forest. And so we were walking along the Florida National Trail, National Scenic Trail, Florida Trail. I'm going to just give you an idea what that is if you don't know. It's a trail that is sort of like the Appalachian Trail that goes, over a long distance, a continuous footpath over a long distance. And there's 13 of these, I believe, that are designated National Scenic Trails by an act of Congress, and the Florida Trail is one of those. So the Appalachian Trail, Pacific Crest Trail, Continental Divide Trail, all are National Scenic Trails, and we have our very own. And it goes from the Everglades down here all the way up through around Orlando, around Lake Okeechobee and around Orlando, and then it goes up, to the Swanee River, goes across along the Swanee River for a while, goes down, dips around the Big Bend of Florida, and goes all the way out to the Panhandle. I don't have the Panhandle on this map, but it goes all the way out to Pensacola. So it goes from the Everglades to Pensacola. It's about 1,100 miles. Just for reference, the Appalachian Trail is 2,200 miles, I think. So it's a big state, as you probably all realize, but not everybody realizes how big Florida is. And so we can, between the northerly route and then the westerly route out the Panhandle, we could get 1,100 miles of continuous hiking. So we did a little bit of it there over 3 days in the Seminole State Forest. And this is a little closer up map. Hold on one sec, let me let these people in. All right. Okay, so the Florida National Scenic Trail, Florida Trail always is looking for newer and better routes as they get access through public lands or private easements on private lands. And one of the main objectives that we have is to eliminate walking on roads. We want as much as possible to be walking through natural spaces. And for the most part it is, but there's still about maybe 250 or 300 miles of this trail that go along roads. And so of those 1,100 miles, you got 200 or 300 that aren't exactly as scenic as we'd like them. So they're continually looking for new routes and rerouting every year. They eliminate some of these roadwalks, the dreaded roadwalks. So this is the way the trail used to run just a year ago. And I'll kind of highlight that for you so you can see it better. This map's kind of hard. So this is the Florida Trail here. It goes up through the forest, the national forest here. And then it used to take this, it's the new route. Sorry, I advanced my slide too quickly. All right, so the old route is, it took this turn up here towards what they call the Cassia Trailhead. And then as you can see, there's this big road here, State Road 44. It's a very busy road for a country road. So there was about 2 or 3 miles here that you have to walk along that busy country road, and then you'd come back out onto the other section of the forested trail. And so that was the old route, but we were lucky enough that they rerouted the trail so that by the time that we took our hike, it was, let me clear this. It was rerouted so that we avoided that roadwalk. And this was the new route. Whoops. Not drawing too well. try that again. Oops. There we go. So the new road went up through here. So it avoided this this area here, which was your old spur out to 44, and then it eliminated this whole section of road walk. So that was nice. So we really were able to walk all the way in all of these beautiful ecosystems that exist along this route. So here's our trail map. This is the route that we took. And we were kind of going backwards, I guess you could say. It's kind of like the British drive on the right. I mean, on the left, we drive on the right. To us, we're backwards. So there's really no right way, but most people think of the trail as going north to south, but a lot of people like to go south to from north to south. Sorry, most people think of the trail as going from south to north or northbound, and but some of us like to do it backwards and go from north to south. So that's the way we were going this time. And so we started up at this trailhead called Clearwater Lake Trailhead, and that's actually it's actually in Ocala National Forest, which is right north of here. You probably have seen some of Bill's programs on Ocala National Forest. I think he's done a few. Let me admit these new people. Yep. And so you may be familiar with that. Well, that's just north of this section in the Seminole State Forest. So we started there. We met down here at the southern end of our route and combined in some cars and then drove up, and we began our hike actually from Clearwater Lake, and then we hiked south. So our first day was about 5.5 miles, and we stayed at this sawgrass fill camp, and I'll show you some pictures of that. We'll talk about that day. And then on day 2, we went down to the sulfur camp, and that was, again, this new route through the Florida Trail that avoided this road walk. And so we were probably some of the first hikers to go on this route. It was really well groomed. It was really beautiful. And we also had an option for hikers that couldn't hike with us 3 days. They could just come out for the weekend and had to get back to work on Monday. So we had an option that they could leave early, and this was their route. It was actually the old route of the Florida Trail, and it goes out to that Cassia trailhead. So they parked here. It actually turned out to be, the 2 hikers were a woman and her dog. So we had 2 2-day hikers, if you include the dog. And then we had, so we drove up and we picked her up, and she left her car there, and then we ended up, parking some cars up at Clearwater Lake, and then we did our hike southbound. So at Clearwater Lake, one of the interesting features is it's a beautiful campground, by the way. If you ever want to just do some car camping or something, it's a nice lake there, Clearwater Lake, and it's a really kind of an old, historic, kind of old Florida type of a campground, and it's the southernmost point in that Ocala National Forest, which is just a wonderful place to get out in nature and to do hikes. And so the Florida Trail actually began at Clearwater Lake, and they kind of blazed 26 miles? Yeah, 26 miles northwest from Clearwater Lake into the Ocala National Forest. And that was the first section that was completed of the Florida Trail. And now, as I mentioned, and that was back in 1966. So, and as I mentioned, now it's the entire length of the state of Florida. And so once that was completed, then they applied to Congress, and in 1983, it was designated a National Scenic Trail. So that plaque is right there when you begin your walk, as you can see. So here's our group. We're posing in front of that placard. And so if you're going northbound into the Ocala National Forest, you'd be kind of going this way. And we were going southbound. So we headed out this way through this, this nice mixed hardwood forest here. And the first thing you do is cross a road, State Road 42. And then you get into a little bit of a walk. And then next thing you know, you're at this Boy Scout camp. So it's that's a little different. And so you're kind of on the outskirts of the property for this Boy Scout camp. And we even had a hiker with us who's, around my age, has been around a while. And he grew up in Central Florida. And he actually went to this Boy Scout camp when he was a Boy Scout, a youth. So it's kind of interesting. They have these obstacle courses. They've got a zip line that they built. So it's kind of fun to walk past them. And of course, some of our kids in our group can't resist, but getting on the stuff and playing around with it and jumping up and down on these obstacles. Next, after the Boy Scout camp, you go through a habitat, a plant community that's unique to Florida. I mean, scrub is different kinds of scrub around the world, but this is a particular Florida scrub, which is really only found in Florida. It's kind of like the Everglades. You really don't find the Everglades anywhere else on Earth, and you really don't find Florida scrub like this anywhere else on Earth. So this is pretty unique. It's also pretty rare. A lot of it's been developed upon, so there's not a lot of natural scrub left in the state. And so there's a few different types of scrub. Scrub is basically a very sandy soil. We'll talk about it in a little bit more about what it is, how it came to be. But you just generally get these very low-lying trees and then this very sandy, dry soil without a lot of ground cover on it. And so this type of scrub is called a rosemary scrub because you have these rosemary plants. They're Florida rosemary. If you can see those leaves, it kind of looks like the herb rosemary if you've ever grown it in your garden, but it's quite a bit, well, it's bigger than probably what you got in your herb garden. And it isn't really related. It's not, there's no culinary application for this plant. It just looks like a rosemary. But that's a particular type of rosemary, a particular type of scrub that we have in Florida. And it's interesting because we also have the second type of the third type of scrub on this particular hike, on this route, and that's called a pine scrub. So you can see us walking along a little road or a path that's going through this pine scrub. And you can see the sandy soil here, and you can kind of tell this is actually kind of a high scrub, but that's about the highest you'll ever see trees in a scrub. It's more like what's in the foreground here. So typically 10 or 15 feet high is the highest type of a tree you'll see there. These are more like 30 feet high. And so these are a particular kind of pine called a sand pine. And so that's what you'll find in a pine scrub. And they're quite a bit shorter, quite a bit stubbier, shorter pine needles, and these tiny little pine cones. So that's a little different. That's interesting. And so here's the scrub, and here's how the scrub came to be. It was once a beach. As you probably all know, Florida was once just about completely covered with ocean. And as sea levels have risen and fallen, as the climates change throughout the long history of the Earth, this peninsula has been covered with water, and then the peninsula has grown as the water receded in colder times. And so 3 million years ago, this ancient ridge formed along the center of this peninsula, and it was always above water. So this has been the sort of the little island in the middle of this big ocean or sea that was once Florida. And so because of that, it's retained its sandy nature. And this sand is very nutrient poor. It's not like full of good humus, and good rich soil that you would plant most crops in. Only certain kinds of vegetation will grow here that are able to be drought tolerant. The other aspect of these habitats is that they're fire controlled. They tend to have a natural fire cycle of 5 to 20 years of fires, and that tends to burn the undergrowth and keep these areas sandy and not a lot of ground covering on them. There's a lot of other reasons why there's not a lot of ground cover. Not a lot of plants can really adapt to living in this sandy soil. So we saw two of the types of scrub. We saw a pine and a rosemary scrub, and there's also an oak scrub, which is not in this forest. And some of the animals that you think of in the scrub are the gopher tortoise. And so we find him along in the maritime forests in Florida, up on the dunes, approaching the forests and barrier islands. And we also find him in the scrub. And he digs a burrow, and up to 300 species cohabitate with him in that burrow. So he's what they call a keystone species, because a lot of other species depend on him digging, or her or them digging their burrow. The other interesting species in the scrub is this scrub jay, and this is what's called endemic. It's only found in the Florida scrub. So you'll only find this bird in these few sections left in Florida that have scrub. So it's a threatened species. There's a lot being done to preserve it. You can see this one is banded. So I didn't see a gopher tortoise actually when I was out on that particular hike. We've seen a lot of them around on other hikes. But we did see some scrub jays. There's a few nesting areas throughout the area and throughout that route that we took. But I don't have a good enough telephoto to get my own picture for you. So I got this picture so I could show you what he looks like. So the first night we reached Sawgrass Fill Camp, and that is in the middle of this pine scrub. So you can see we're walking on the trail. This blue blaze here means that it's a side trail, and you could see the little camping symbol. So we kind of walked this little side trail out through the scrub, through these little short pine trees, and then we got into this camp, which was really quite nice. A couple of picnic tables, there's a fire ring, and other nice feature of it is there's a pond, a little path, and you maybe go a couple 100 feet away from the campground, the campsite, and then there's this access to the water of this nice big pond. So it's good for drinking water, to filter it, of course, so that you can make sure it's not going to have anything in there that'll hurt you, but it's good water. And so that makes it a really beautiful place to camp. We had a really nice sunset that night. And another astronomical occurrence for that weekend was a supermoon. And maybe you remember that from the beginning of this year. I believe there were 2 or 3 months in a row where we had supermoons. So a supermoon is when the moon is full at the same time it reaches its perigee, which is the orbit of the moon around the Earth. It's the closest point in that orbit to the Earth. So it appears, a bit bigger than normal. So we had kind of a very bright moon that night, which was pretty. Okay, day 2, we went out into a completely different habitat. So that's one thing interesting about this state forest and this particular route is all the different habitats we crossed through in just this 1, 2 day, 3 day period. So this is a wet prairie. So a wet prairie is wet over 6 months of the year. It looks like a marsh if you look at this view here, but it's not. This is all fresh water, of course. We're inland quite a ways. But it looks like one of our coastal marshes if you've been out on, Talbot Island or any of our barrier islands on the shore side or the mainland side. you'll see these salt marshes, but this is not a salt marsh. This is an inland wet prairie. So these grasses that grow here are freshwater. They're not salt tolerant like you find in an estuarine marsh, salt marsh. And actually, this is a dead pine tree, but because it doesn't have needles, but this gives you an example of the size of these pine cones on a sand pine. This is a sand pine. And so, and how they tend to cling for a long time to the trees. You'll see these clusters of pine trees, even pine cones rather, even past the time most other pine cones have fallen down. So they just kind of release them as they go, and you'll find these clusters of pine cones, these little teeny pine cones. And that's one of the signs you're looking at a sand pine. And so they've built these boardwalks out over the wet prairie so you can get over the wetter spots there, and did a pretty good job. And then after the prairie, we got back into the woods. We walked through some pine flatwoods, which are these pretty typical pinelands, which we have in North Florida too. Just tall, straight pines, very low undergrowth, and not a lot of other species of trees. So that's what you're seeing here is a pine flatwood, and they're very pretty and very stately, and they make for a nice quiet walk through on these pine on the pine needle paths here. And then we got into another wetter environment where you find cypress trees. So we had some flooded lowland areas, and they're a little mini cypress swamp. So in the middle of day two, we reached the Cassia Trail, leading out to that Cassia Trailhead that I talked about. So that's when our 2-day hikers departed from us and went the other way. And we just continued through a mixed hardwood forest, a lot of palm trees mixed with pine trees. You don't find that up here too much. It's more of a central Florida phenomenon. And we came to our campground for that night, and right next to that campground was this beautiful spring. So this water is the best tasting water I've tasted on the Florida Trail. There's a lot of gnarly water on the Florida Trail. They had a very, very slow flow, standing water, but you got to get water where you can find it and filter it and use it when you're on a long hike. But this is just a gorgeous, you could probably drink this without filtering, but we never advise that. But it's clear as a bell, and it just tasted so good. So this was a real treat. Now it's called Shark Tooth Spring because there's shark's teeth in here. Again, remember, this used to be all an ocean. So you'll find shark's teeth inland in these springs, but we didn't find any that day. So we camped next to that. I don't have a picture of that campsite. It's called Sulphur Campsite. That night, someone had an alert as to when the orbiter, the space orbiter, was going overhead, and it was a very clear night. And so we had the alert when to see it and when it was going to be visible. And we looked up, and we actually could see the orbiter coming. What is it? The space. Space station, that's what it is. Yeah. So after that, after we camped and we got off the next day, the main feature along that day 3 is this Blackwater Creek. It's a really beautiful body of water, almost river-sized creek, flowing through the Seminole State Forest. And so that was a pretty side trip too. Well, it wasn't a side trip, but it was a really nice area where we could view that creek. And a Blackwater is a very slow moving river that is not like flowing out of a mountain stream from snowpack. And so of course, most of our rivers, except for one that I can think of in Florida, are all Blackwater. And they tend to be very dark water too, because they accumulate detritus from the trees and the leaves that fall into it, because they don't get flushed out as fast by the current. And then finally, we went through several different habitats again on that last part after Blackwater Creek, through prairies, and then a really pretty oak forest, and then finally this beautiful pine flatwood again before we got back to our Bear Pond trailhead and we picked up our cars and we went home. So that was our hike